right, everyone, I need to let you know we are live on Facebook right now, and we'll be live on the county website momentarily. We are now recording as well.
Hello, Mayor Dixon.
Hello, how are you guys?
Doing well.
Hello, this is Rod Jackson, Mayor Portales.
Hello, Mayor.
How's everybody?
So far, I haven't heard any complaints.
I just want to remind everybody, if you're going to have background noise, please keep yourself muted until you're ready to speak.
Okay, can everyone hear me? This is Orlando.
I can hear you.
It's 3 o'clock, and I believe we will go ahead and get started if we can.
I can hear you.
If I may, at this time, I would like to call this joint local government informational workshop to order. On behalf of the organizing group comprised of Curry County Manager Lance Pyle, Clovis City Manager Justin Holwalt, and myself, Orlando Ortega, Administrator of the Eastern New Mexico Water Utility Authority. We'd like to thank you all for your participation today in this workshop titled Land Trusts and Conservation Easements. Mr. Pyle is not able to be with us at this time. Sitting in for him is Mr. Steve Dorr. At this time, we would like to introduce our respected boards and commissions. I will begin by introducing the Eastern New Mexico Water Utility Authority Board. With us is Chairman David Lansford, Vice Chair Ron Jackson, Secretary Chris Bryant, Board Member Juan Garza, Board Member Jim Lucero, Board Member Deward Dixon. I'll pass it over to Justin Howalt, who will introduce his commission.
Thank you, Orlando. And first off, I'd like to thank the county as well as the water utility for also assisting with the city of Clovis and taking the lead on getting this meeting set up. With us this afternoon, we have Mayor Mike Morris. Representing District 1, we have Commissioners Juan Garza, who is also a board member of the Water Utility Authority. We have Commissioner Leo Lovett. From District 2, we have Commissioner Lauren Rowley, as well as Commissioner Gary Elliott. From District 3, we have Commissioner Helen Casals and Commissioner Fidel Madrid. And then from District 4, we have Mayor Pro Tem Chris Bryant, who is also a member of the Eastern New Mexico Water Utility Board. And thank you, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Dorr to introduce the county.
Thank you, Justin. On behalf of Manager Pyle, I'd again express appreciation for everybody showing up and attending this meeting. Representatives of the Board of County Commissioners of Curry County, we have Chairman Robert Thornton present, Commissioner Jim Ridling, Commissioner Chet Spear, Commissioner Seth Martin. I believe Commissioner Robert Sandoval will be joining us sometime later in the meeting.
Thank you, Steve. We also have members of the Central Curry Soil and Water Conservation District Board attending. If the chairman is on, would you like to introduce your board at this time?
The chairman is not on at this time, but Spencer Pipkin is our chairman. Vice chairman is going to be our Eric Nelson. Secretary and treasurer is Doyle Carpenter, who is on with us. And then as members, we have Rachel Armstrong, Clint Harden, Zachary Cordell, and I'm missing one.
KC.
And Casey Schooley, thank you. And then myself, I am the district manager.
Thank you very much. Our presenters today are Mr. Scott Wilbur, Executive Director for the New Mexico Land Conservancy, and Mr. Ron Troy, who is the Southern New Mexico Program Manager with the New Mexico Land Conservancy. At this time, Mr. Howalt will introduce them in more detail.
Thank you, Orlando. And it is my pleasure to introduce both Mr. Wilbur and Mr. Troy to you. They're both with the New Mexico Land Conservancy, and Scott Wilbur is the Executive Director. Scott has 25 years of experience working in land conservation, natural resources, community development, and nonprofit management throughout the Rocky Mountain West and Latin America. He joined the New Mexico Land Conservancy in 2004, first as its conservation director, and then was named executive director in 2006. Scott has worked previously for the Trust of Public Land, Colorado Open Lands, the Nature Conservancy, the Tropical Forest Foundation, and the U.S. Forest Service. He grew up in Wyoming, where he gained his love for the land and the great outdoors. Scott has a Bachelor of Science in Forest Management from Northern Arizona University and a Master's of Arts in Geography from the University of New Mexico. We also have with us this afternoon Ron Troy. He's the Southern New Mexico Program Manager. Ron is based in Silver City and for the past 6 years has been helping NMLC establish a greater presence in the southern part of the state. Prior to joining New Mexico Land Conservancy, Ron spent 7 years focused on protection and restoration of Chinook salmon and steelhead habitat for the Nature Conservancy in Salmon, Idaho. A native of Idaho, Ron's previous experience also includes fishing and whitewater guiding out of Salmon, Idaho, wildlife research in Idaho and New Mexico, commercial real estate in Boise, Idaho, and a small farm and ranch operation in Hondo, New Mexico. Ron holds a Bachelor of Science in Finance from the University of Idaho, a Bachelor of Science in Fish and Wildlife Science from New Mexico State University, go Aggies, and a Master of Science in Biology with an emphasis on ecological restoration from Idaho State University. Please join me in a virtual warm welcome to both of our presenters, and I look forward to hearing what each of them have to give information for us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Just want to point out that the presentation will be about 50 minutes in length. After the presenters have completed their presentation, we will open it up to questions. Our goal is that everyone who wants to ask a question can do so. With that said, I'll go ahead and pass it on to the presenters. Thank you.
Good afternoon. This is Scott Wilbur. I'm the Executive Director of New Mexico Land Conservancy. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you, Scott.
Yes.
Okay, I am going to share my screen with you all. Is everybody able to view the first screen there?
Yes.
Can everybody see the first slide? Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And first and foremost, I want to thank Lance Pyle and Orlando Ortega for organizing this meeting. And I want to also thank the county commissioners of Curry and Roosevelt County, the board members of the Eastern New Mexico Water Utility Authority, and the members of the City of Clovis Commission for taking your time this afternoon to listen to this presentation. We are going to take about 50 minutes to run through a series of slides with you. I'm going to start out by giving you an overview of land trusts and conservation easements, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the New Mexico Land Conservancy and our experience and accomplishments around the state. And then I'm going to wrap my presentation up talking a little bit about working with NMLC or an existing land trust versus creating a new land trust. And then I'm going to turn it over to Ron Troy, our Southern New Mexico Program Manager, who's going to talk more specifically about the water situation in Eastern New Mexico, and then about how conserving land and water through conservation easements combined with land management and restoration might help address your situation. And then, as Orlando mentioned, we're going to open it up to questions and answers at the end. All right, so I'd like to start out just giving you a little background on our organization. We are the statewide land trust for New Mexico, based here in Santa Fe. We're a nationally accredited land trust. We were founded in 2002. Our mission is to help people conserve the places they love. And to accomplish that, we work with private landowners, community-based groups, government agencies, and other public and private partners to conserve land and water at community, watershed, and landscape scales. So just for a little bit of context, as most of you know, about 50% of the land in the West is private, and much of this private land is held by farmers and ranchers. And we all know that the average age of a farmer and rancher these days is somewhere between 55 and 75. So we're going to see one of the largest turnovers in private land over the next 20 years. And yes?
If anybody is not muted other than the speaker, Mr. Wilbur, can you please make sure and mute yourselves?
I thank Jacqueline too. She helped me get a new.
I think I got it.
Okay, can I go ahead? At the end.
Yes, sir.
All right.
God, are the slides advancing for everybody out there?
We're still on the first slide, sir.
Yeah, Scott, for some reason, I think the slides aren't advancing.
Let's see what's happening here. Let me try this again.
So
Let's see here. Sorry, everybody. Okay, can everybody see this?
Back to the first slide, sir.
Okay, are they advancing now?
Yes, sir, they are.
Okay, great. Thank you for your patience. All right, so as we're all aware, New Mexico is one of the top 10 fastest growing states in the nation, with a population that's projected to increase 35% over the next 25 years. And this growth is resulting in the conversion of over 50,000 acres of undeveloped land each year, as well as the loss of associated water and water rights. So what's a land trust? Basically, a land trust is a nonprofit 501c3 land conservation organization that uses easements, fee acquisition, management agreements, and restoration to conserve and restore land and water. And at the core, it's really a grassroots expression of people's commitment to the protection, conservation, and restoration of land and water for conservation purposes and public benefits. So just to give you a sense of how the land trust movement has grown in the United States, this is a movement that is over 100 years old. The original land trusts emerged in the northeastern part of the United States. And at that time, there weren't a lot of federal land management agencies. Most of the land was privately owned, and concerned citizens were concerned about the amount of development they were seeing and the impact that this was having on certain areas of interest. And they decided to form land trusts as a mechanism for protecting those lands. And by the 1980s, we see the land trust community growing to about 400 land trusts nationwide. This is about the time that Congress created the tax deduction for conservation easement donations. And the movement has continued to grow. And today we've got over 1,600 land trusts in the United States. Here in the West, the movement is still relatively new. In New Mexico, as I mentioned, we are the statewide land trust. There are a handful of other local trusts. Taos has a local land trust, Santa Fe has a land trust, and there's a small land trust called the Rio Grande Agricultural Land Trust that focuses on the middle Rio Grande Valley. But all of these trusts are less than 30 years old, so it's still a fairly new movement here in New Mexico. But having said that, over 1 million acres of land have been placed under easement here in New Mexico. And at the national level, about 50 million acres are under conservation easement. And just to give you a sense of the scale of that, that's basically equivalent to all the land inside the national park system in the lower 48. So the primary tool that land trusts use to conserve land is called a conservation easement. And essentially what an easement is a voluntary legal agreement between a landowner and a land trust to prevent or restrict subdivision, development, and certain other uses of the subject land in order to protect its conservation values or provide some kind of public benefit. And this slide just shows some of the different examples of the conservation values that land trusts are trying to protect. Everything from wildlife habitat, natural communities, to water and environmental services, to protecting productive agricultural forestry lands and natural resources on those lands. We work to protect scenic viewsheds and open space, cultural historic sites, and easements are also done for outdoor recreation and environmental education purposes. So just a few basic concepts. The first rule is that the land must have certain values that are worthy of conservation. So we're not just putting conservation easements over, parking lots and gravel pits. I mean, we're seeking out lands that have significant conservation values or provide some kind of public benefit. And I think it's important to understand that this is not a regulatory mechanism or a takings. Easements are voluntary and they respect private property rights. And another important concept about conservation easements is that the land stays in private ownership and remains on the tax rolls. So landowners can still continue to use their land for farming and ranching and other compatible uses, but the main goal of the easement is to restrict subdivision and development of those properties. And as part of that process, we're typically tying the water rights to the land through the conservation easement. Public access is not required because the land still is in private ownership, but it is sometimes granted on a voluntary basis by the landowner for purposes of hunting and fishing access, trails, and that sort of thing. And then another really important concept is that these are perpetual agreements that run with the land and bind future owners to the terms of the easements. Having said that, the subject land can still be leased, sold, and passed on to heirs. So a few other basic concepts. Easements can be donated or they can be sold by the landowners to either a qualified nonprofit land trust, such as the New Mexico Land Conservancy, or to a government agency that is willing to hold easements. I will say that about 80 or 90% of the easements in the country are held by nonprofit land trusts. When government agencies do get into the business of holding easements, it typically involves public open space and trails programs, or in the case of like an agency like Game and Fish that may hold easements with some public hunting and fishing access. But the majority of easements in the country are held by nonprofit land trusts. And I'm going to talk more about this in detail later, but tax and financial incentives are what's providing the motivation and in some cases compensation for these easements, because after all, these private landowners are giving up substantial development and other rights on their land forever. So I wanted to just real quickly kind of walk you through the basic steps of putting a conservation easement into place and explaining what's involved with holding an easement. A conservation easement is a real estate transaction. So like, any real estate transaction, there's going to be a lot of due diligence involved. But generally, the process starts with landowner outreach and negotiation. So, again, this is a voluntary process. In many cases, landowners are reaching out to us because they're interested in exploring a conservation easement. In other cases, we might be working with some kind of a federal funding program in a very specific targeted area where we're reaching out to a group of landowners and trying to get them interested in considering an easement. Once we do reach an agreement to move forward with the landowner, we usually enter into either a simple letter of intent that outlines. the basic terms under which we're going to work together, or in some cases, particularly when funding is involved, we might enter into a more formal option agreement or purchase agreement. And as I said, I mean, this is a real estate transaction, so there's, you know, a bunch of due diligence that we've got to do in order to complete the easement, you know, starting with review of title. We look at mineral and water rights, and we also often conduct an environmental assessment to make sure there's no environmental hazards on the subject property. And then one of the important steps that we have to complete in order to qualify for potential tax deduction is what's called a baseline documentation report. And this is essentially a description of the property. You know, what are the sort of biophysical characteristics, you know, what kind of vegetative communities are on the property. You know, we look at what's the current management on the property. And typically this report will include a series of maps, you know, describing different features on the property. And then we set up a series of photo points. And the reason that this is called a baseline documentation is because once the easement's in place, we have a responsibility to monitor it, and we return to the property every year and basically revisit these photo points on the property. So this baseline documentation is something that is required by the IRS if the landowner is seeking any kind of charitable deduction. And then we get into the process of negotiating the actual easement terms, which ultimately leads to, you know, drafting of the conservation easement deed and its final legal review. And then the last step is getting the easement appraised. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. But basically, it's, you know, it's a two-step process where we have to first look at the value of the land before the easement is put on it, and then the appraiser has to look at the value of the land subject to the easement and determine, you know, what is the loss of value due to the restrictions in the conservation easement. And then once all of that due diligence work is done and the appraisal is completed, we record the conservation easement deed with the county clerk's office in which the property is located. So that pretty much completes the process of getting the easement in place. And then we typically work with the landowner on filing their federal tax return so that they can pursue the deduction that's associated with the easement and potentially apply for the state tax credit. And then the last thing is really important because these are perpetual agreements. We as the land trust essentially have a responsibility to monitor these easements every year to ensure compliance with the terms of the easement. And in the event that there were a violation of the conservation easement, we have the responsibility to legally defend that easement. So I mentioned the appraisal process. This is a very important step, obviously, to determine the value of the easement. And this is just an example of how we arrive at that value. If we start out with a fair market value of $1 million, and then the appraiser determines that the loss of value from the easement is $400,000, this means that the easement encumbered property is going to be $600,000. So as I said, it's basically a two-step appraisal process, starting with determining the value of the property before the easement is put onto place, and that's done through a comparative sales analysis. And then the appraiser needs to look at what are the terms in the conservation easement, what's actually being restricted, and determine how much that easement is going to reduce that property's value. And that value is going to represent the value of their potential federal deduction, state tax credit, or a potential payment. So why might landowners want to consider a conservation easement? I mean, Obviously, tax relief is an incentive. Financial benefits can also be an incentive. And oftentimes conservation easements are just part of the estate planning that a landowner may want to do to perhaps ensure that the land is going to remain in the family or remain available for ranching. So essentially, what an easement is it's an opportunity to maintain a certain vision for the land, its resource use, and its long-term stewardship. So I mentioned that conservation easements can be donated or sold. In the case of a donated easement, a voluntary donation of a conservation easement in perpetuity to a qualified organization such as a land trust is considered a charitable non-cash gift for federal and state tax purposes. So here, I'm giving you some examples of the qualifying criteria in order for an easement to qualify for the federal and state tax benefits. So an easement must meet what the IRS calls its conservation purposes or public benefits test by protecting at least one of the following. The property either has to have relatively natural habitat, it's got to have scenic open space, it can be productive forest, farm, or ranch land. It can have some historic or cultural resources, or it may provide some kind of public, recreational, or educational opportunity. So if it meets one of these criteria, it can qualify under the IRS for a federal deduction. And the other important criteria is that it must be granted in perpetuity to a qualified organization, such as a land trust or a government agency. So I mentioned that there are both federal income tax deductions as well as state tax credits available for landowners that donate easements. So in this slide, I'm showing what the deduction, the federal deduction is for ordinary taxpayers. So an individual landowner can deduct up to 50% of their adjusted gross income on their federal income taxes for up to 16 years or until the value of the donation is used up. And that holds true as well for corporate landowners. They can deduct up to 50% of their federal taxable income for up to 16 years or until the value of the donation is used up. And then this is a fairly new change to the tax code, but qualifying ranchers and farmers that earn at least half of their income from agricultural activities can receive up to 100% deduction of their adjusted gross income. And that's true for both individual and corporate agricultural landowners. And then I mentioned that here in New Mexico, we are very fortunate to have a state tax credit program. So we're one of 5 states in the country that has this kind of state tax credit for land conservation. And the tax credit is for 50% of the value of a qualified donation of land or easement up to a maximum of $250,000. So in other words, a landowner would have to have an easement that's worth at least $500,000 in order to receive the maximum credit of $250,000. And under the New Mexico statute, a husband and wife may each claim a credit up to a combined total of $500,000. They can each claim a credit of $250,000 for a combined total of $500,000. And these credits can either be used to offset the landowner's state tax liability, or they can be sold at a discounted rate over a 20-year period. And our tax credits here in New Mexico are selling for about 80% of their face value. So, essentially the way this works is once the credit is issued by the state of New Mexico, they have to be sold through a qualified broker. The brokers are responsible for finding the buyers, and typically the buyers are getting a 10% discount right off the bat when they purchase these credits, and then the brokers keep about a 10% commission, leaving the landowner with an 80% net return from the sale of their tax credit. Right now in New Mexico, only one credit can be earned or transferred per year. And then it's important to mention that the income from the sale of the tax credit is treated as ordinary income. So the sale of that credit will create a taxable event. And then finally, another benefit is the impact that easements can have on property taxes. As I mentioned, with easements, the land does stay in private ownership, does stay on the tax rolls, but typically easements do significantly reduce property taxes on the subject property, depending on the county, the zoning, and the amount of development rights that are given up. So in some states, like Colorado, if you grant a conservation easement, you get 100% exemption from property taxes. But here in New Mexico, it's on a county by county basis, and it's determined by the tax assessor how much the property taxes will be reduced. If the land is already being taxed as agricultural, it'll be continued to be taxed at that rate if it continues to be used for that purpose. And then finally, I mentioned that easements can be sold if there's funding available, and the income from the sale of an easement is treated as a capital gain. And of course, this will create a taxable event for the landowner as well, and the amount of federal capital gains tax owed will depend on the landowner's basis in the land. And then I mentioned the income from the sale of the state tax credits is typically treated as ordinary income. But one thing that's important to note here that many times when we're doing purchased easements with some kind of public funding source, as you all are probably well aware, typically the public funders, whether it's an NRCS program or a Department of Defense program or a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service program, will pay somewhere between 50 and 80% of the value of the easement. And they are essentially requiring the landowner to donate the balance as match towards the federal funding provided. But what we do here is essentially what's called a bargain sale, where we're combining both a payment to the landowner, a partial payment to the landowner, with a donation of the residual value. And so for any donation of value that they make, they would be eligible for both the federal and state tax benefits that I mentioned previously. And that federal deduction and the state tax credit can be used to offset the capital gains from the sale of the easement. In this slide, I just wanted to show you kind of the breadth of the work that we're doing around the state of New Mexico. You can see here the extent of our easements around the state. The yellow dots are depicting easements that were completed prior to 2020. And then the red dots are depicting easements that we completed last year. But we currently have completed about 110 conservation easements, totaling about 325,000 acres of natural and working lands around the state of New Mexico and in southeast Arizona, in many cases, including the pertinent water rights. And then I wanted to give you a sense of some of the work that we're currently doing around the state of New Mexico. One of the big projects that we're working on right now is down at White Sands Missile Range. We are working with the Department of Defense through their REPI program, which is the Readiness and Environmental Protection Integration Program, on a 5-year project to acquire conservation easements in an 800,000 acre buffer zone that they've identified around White Sands Missile Range in order to essentially prevent incompatible development that would interfere with their operations and their testing at White Sands Missile Range. So what they're primarily concerned about over there are things like wind farms, transmission lines, communication towers, and other vertical structures that would interfere with their aerial operations. And we've entered into a 5-year cooperative agreement with up to $25 million of potential funding. And we're about 3 years into that project, and so far have put about 50,000 acres under easement for a total of about $6.5 million. We are working also with Cannon Air Force Base. We worked under a subcontract with the Conservation Fund on a DoD REPI project with the Air Force, which resulted in protecting about 30,000 acres for a total cost of $1 million. And then we've also worked quite a bit with the NRCS Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. Over the last 16 years, we have been successful in securing probably the bulk of this particular type of funding that's been made available to the state of New Mexico. And we've been successful in completing about 15 conservation easements so far throughout New Mexico and Arizona, totaling about 57,000 acres for a total of about $12 million in federal funding, plus private matching funds that we were able to secure to leverage those federal dollars. We've also done some work down in the southeast part of the state, southeast of Portales in the Milnesand area. We worked on a New Mexico prairie chicken conservation mitigation project where we partnered with Excel Energy, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and a mitigation company out of Texas that had done a number of these projects in Texas and was looking for an opportunity to work in New Mexico. And the basic concept here is that we're dealing with a federally and state endangered species that is going to be impacted by the increasing number of wind farms that are being developed in eastern New Mexico. And this is essentially a voluntary program where Excel Energy opted to invest in this mitigation bank to offset the impacts that they anticipated from their Sagamore wind farm, which has recently come online. And basically what we did is identify a large ranch that was adjacent to some other areas that had already been protected for a large preserve owned by the Nature Conservancy, as well as another private ranch that was under easement. And we are working over a period of years to place this property under easement. We put 2,000 acres under easement so far, and there's also a large endowment that's been established. And the interest income off that endowment is going to fund a series of management activities on the ground that will help enhance habitat for the prairie chicken. And then the last project that I wanted to mention is the Farmland Preservation Program with the Village of Corrales. In this particular community, if you're familiar with Corrales, it's a kind of a traditional agricultural community on the Rio Grande that's located in between the city of Albuquerque and the city of Rio Rancho. Tremendous development pressure, and the local residents were concerned about the loss of ag land and open space, and so they opted to tax themselves through a bond and successfully passed that bond. And then we were able to leverage the bond funds to secure some additional federal funding through NRCS and purchase 7 conservation easements throughout the village. And here I'm just kind of giving you a sense of the different partners that we've worked with around the state. So I mentioned, we've worked with a number of federal and state partners, including Department of Defense, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We've worked with State Game and Fish and the Forestry Division and DOT. We've partnered with a number of local municipalities, such as the Village of Corrales, City of Albuquerque, Silver City, Grant County, and we've worked with a number of other conservation nonprofits, such as the Playa Lakes Joint Venture, which is doing a lot of work in eastern New Mexico right now, Trust for Public Land, the Nature Conservancy, the Conservation Fund, and other land trusts. And we've also partnered with a number of corporations, including a number of power companies like Element Power, SunZia, and Excel Energy. And finally, I'm going to wrap up my part of the presentation, just talking a little bit about working with an existing land trust versus creating a new land trust, because I know this is something that you guys are currently thinking about right now. And I guess, first and foremost, I would say that, one of the primary advantages of working with an existing land trust is the experience and know-how that a statewide organization such as New Mexico Land Conservancy has. We've been doing this kind of work now for 18 years with a demonstrated track record. 80% of our work has been on working farms and ranches, and we have a very good understanding of all of what is involved with, putting together an easement, running a successful land trust, and ensuring, the long-term sustainability of the work that we do. We have an established organizational framework, and we have capacity in place. Ron is our Southern New Mexico program manager, covering, the southern part of the state. But we're now in the process of hiring an additional staff person to support Ron in Southern New Mexico because of the growth of our work, particularly in that part of the state. We're an accredited land trust, and this has become really important in the last few years. The land trust community reached out several years ago to our National Land Trust Alliance and asked them to basically develop a set of standards and practices for the industry. And we have been successfully accredited and actually just recently completed our first renewal. So we're good to go for another 5 years. And then the last thing that I'll mention is costs. Obviously there are a lot of costs associated with getting the easements in place, the actual transactional costs and the acquisition costs. Many times these kinds of costs will be covered by funders, but there are a lot of other things that need to be considered. And one of those is long-term stewardship. So once the easement's in place, as I mentioned, we have to annually monitor those easements. We have to legally defend them. And we're actually fortunate now that we're participating in a national insurance program that provides about $500,000 of coverage for our conservation easement portfolio. And then last but not least, there's the operating costs for running the land trust. And as you can all imagine, putting together and keeping a land trust going over a period of years obviously costs a lot of money. And if you guys were to think about creating your own land trust, I think it's important to understand what all is involved with doing that. A land trust is a nonprofit organization, and there's a number of steps that you would have to go through to put that kind of organization into place. Starting out with, creating a board, developing bylaws and articles of incorporation, and then actually going through the process of obtaining the nonprofit status from the IRS. It would be necessary to recruit, at a minimum, a director to run the land trust, but there would probably be a need for additional support staff to, support the actual project work as well as the administration of the organization. And then of course, there's the whole the process of raising funds and administration, which can be very time consuming and sometimes draw attention away from the actual mission of land conservation. And then there's compliance issues to think about with the IRS, with the state, with the National Land Trust Alliance, and other requirements that have to be met. Audits, annual tax returns, and all of those sorts of things. So I think it's just important to understand that if you're going to create a new land trust from scratch, there's a lot involved with a significant cost, and it may actually be much more efficient to consider working with an existing land trust that already has that capacity. All right, with that, I'm going to conclude my part of the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Ron, who's going to talk more specifically about your situation in Eastern New Mexico and how we might be able to help.
Scott, do you want to just leave that up and we'll just kind of switch slides instead of taking the risk of any technical issues?
Sounds good.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone for allowing me to present. I'm Ron Troy, and as Scott mentioned, I'm the Southern New Mexico Program Manager. And yeah, I've been involved kind of coming across the state over to Roosevelt and Curry counties. And looking at this situation for a while over the past 5 years, I think we've kind of been invited on different occasions to present at different events, and then also just talking with different folks there in the communities and at the Air Force Base, and just kind of looking at how we might solve this with conservation easements and the work we do. And so I kind of am more focused here on the presentation of your specific goals and objectives for Curry and Roosevelt counties, and with the Eastern New Mexico Water Utility Authority in the shared region with all the various communities there, and just you guys have a big challenge ahead of you with the water situation and in trying to balance that with the economics of the area and the economic growth. The time frame you're looking at based on the studies that New Mexico Tech did with respect to the Ogallala and the water resources there and the decline. And so the other big, I guess, consideration here is the financial wherewithal and the funding sources to solve those problems that you're looking at, or those challenges. So Scott, you want to move to the next slide? So in the water dynamics world, you guys have a huge head start, even though some of that, information that you have is 5 years old or so now, or more. You do have a lot of research as to what the water, just the water hydraulics under your various communities look like, which is something a lot of folks can't say. So I know you guys have invested a lot of time and money there. So you're in my mind ahead of the game there with respect to looking at the quantity and the sustainability of the water there, and also the water quality issues in your area. And so when you look at that, I think there's a lot of questions out there as far as the distribution systems. If you were to look at, I know one of the big targets here is that are the landowners over the Paleo Channel and the water situation there. And if you secure water over, say, the Paleo Channel, and are able to curtail the use of water with respect to farming practices over that area, question becomes then, do you need to distribute that water above ground through piping or canals, ditches, etc., or can it just be left in the Ogallala as a conservation measure to hopefully at one point in time get a balance of use of water versus recharge of that aquifer. So these are all big questions I think you guys have to wrestle with and have been wrestling with for a long time as you solve these problems. And I guess go ahead. The question there becomes, how tied are you guys to a specific set of landowners? And I think that's a question you need to continually ask yourselves, as you probably have been, and how much money is a trade-off of a set group of landowners versus opportunistically looking at the same curtailment of water across a broader area. And so also the term here, when you look at making these deals with these farmers out in that area and having them curtail that water, you're looking at it from a long-term perspective, keeping in mind our conservation easements are in perpetuity versus a short-term agreement, say 20 years or whatever, and I think we all know as we get older how fast 20 years goes by. And so those are big questions that you have to ask yourself with respect to the public benefit, the public dollars you're going to be spending. That water is, when you think of water in 20 years, to go back and try to renegotiate another deal when water is more scarce and more valuable, I think these are all considerations you have to look at as part of your decision making here with respect to conservation easements or securing them in another fashion through a water trust, etc. So as you look at that, I'm thinking the Office of State Engineer. Scott mentioned a lot of the work we've done in this state. And I'm sorry, Scott, if you could go back to that last slide. One of my experiences is with conservation easement work and securing water is up in Idaho. We had a similar challenge, but it had to do with actually spawning grounds for Chinook salmon and steelhead, and actually working with the ranchers and farmers in that area to actually change their irrigation practices, opening up stream habitat, going from flood irrigation and actually moving to pivots and or abandoning some of these areas and dry farming, or putting them into large riparian pastures that were, we had a myriad of ways that we structured these conservation easements to protect water and habitat for spawning salmon and steelhead, and still keep these ranchers and farmers, keeping them in a viable farming and ranching operation, using these fundings for infrastructure, et cetera, or just compensation to benefit them for doing that. So it's a really similar situation, in my opinion, and it's a challenging situation, and it takes a lot of it just takes a lot of patience and a lot of time, and I think a lot of know-how and a lot of innovation, if you will, and a lot of creativity. As you target these water rights, another reason you bring the state engineer in is, in 10 years, let's say, you guys are going to have a pretty desperate situation potentially, depending on precipitation over the next 10 years. But when things get really desperate in that area, and I know you guys have given this thought, but how do you curtail water rights? It's usually based on senior versus junior water rights. And so where do those senior and junior water rights sit in your community? And are you targeting the right farms with respect to productivity, the amount of water you can secure, and cost? And are the landowners being reasonable in negotiating those deals when they're looking at that seniority, or of their water rights, basically, and that potential curtailment down the line. And there's a number of ways we did this up in Idaho, and that was sometimes the ranchers, farmers would abandon the water rights entirely. You basically you remove those water rights. You can transfer those water rights to another entity. You can lease those water rights to another entity. You can bank those water rights into a water conservation trust or something to that effect, a tool. And I see Peter's on the call here, and he can speak a lot more intelligently to that aspect of it. And I think he has for you all. I think so anyhow, there's a number of mechanisms in which you can protect that water and or transfer that water. And again, the state engineer is key in bringing them into this partnership, this collaborative effort in looking at that short-term and long-term and the mechanisms in which you're able to do that. And so, okay, Scott, thanks. Next slide. So there's two alternatives how you guys could look at this situation, in my opinion. One is, if you go, this is alternative one, and this is where you deal with the landowner, you put together a conservation easement, and under that conservation easement, that serves as the umbrella for a lot of different outcomes, i.e. the water outcome, however you want to structure that water outcome. And the water trust could be under, it could, these aren't mutually exclusive, the conservation easement and the water trust. You're working with the water trust. They're holding that water under the conservation easement, and they're protecting that water in some fashion. And then you can deal with it under that structure of the water trust, whether you utilize that water for municipal or in commercial uses or those agricultural practices or combination thereof. Then also under the conservation easement, you would have this restoration component. So when you put this conservation easement on this land, you also think along the lines of recharging that aquifer, and for instance, on through restoring some tilled land or cornfield back into a playa lakes with and returning it back into a naturally functioning system. So that you're doing two things at once. You're recharging that aquifer at the same time you're reducing the water take. Vince DeMaio, I think, is a great example of what he's done on his property. So there is no actual conservation easement there. Some of those practices were voluntary, and he's done some of those practices. This is where you would compensate him for a conservation easement to do those same types of things. The nice thing about a conservation easement, as Scott said, it curtails, it restricts the subdivision and development of that property. So one of the things you really have to be careful with here is you get this great water outcome. You change all these management practices on this land, and now you have recharge, you have less water usage. But now this landowner goes out and he subdivides and he develops his parcel, 120 acres into 100 lots, and now you have 100 residential units out there with that same water demand, and so you're back to a net zero for all of that money you have spent on that water outcome. So again, this is where the conservation easement serves as a nice umbrella to really look long term at the solution to your water situation in that area. And then lastly, you have these agricultural practices on that land. If you really have to think as you're negotiating these deals, how do you structure a conservation easement or any agreement for that matter in a manner that you can monitor and enforce it in the future. And so as a lot of you are aware, those landowners over the Paleo Channel and landowners all over the country, they're happy to conserve their water oftentimes, but not necessarily if they just know that water is going down to their neighbor and their neighbor's going to use it anyhow, and it's not really going to the intended use, or it's going back into a commercial use that somebody else might just go ahead and use that same water to make the same money they were making, and you have a net zero. So those landowners, I think they're looking at if they do sell that water, or do a conservation easement or however they structure that, the deal, they want that, a lot of that water left in the Ogallala to recharge that Ogallala and not just be used by another user. And so how do you really structure that so you can monitor and enforce that? And those are the things that Scott and I deal with on a day-to-day basis with when we structure these easements, something that we as a land trust that do the monitoring enforcement every year in and year out, we know it's so critical to be able to structure those in a manner that we are able to monitor and enforce it long term in perpetuity. So go ahead to the next slide. So this is alternative 2. This is kind of how I have, just being involved out there the last, I guess, 5 years in some discussions out there. And this is kind of another structure that I guess I'm leery of for a couple of reasons, but this is where you still have a conservation easement, but under the umbrella of the conservation easement isn't the water outcome necessarily. You actually have another agreement with the landowner that's a water outcome. So you're negotiating a water deal on one side, and then you're negotiating conservation easement on those management practices on the land as another avenue, and they're mutually exclusive. And so now from a monitoring and enforcement standpoint, it adds a whole nother layer of complexity to this. And it doesn't so if you're just negotiating a water deal and you don't have all of these other potential restoration and playa lakes and the subdivision and the development and the agricultural practices along with that, how do you monitor that long term, and how do you enforce it? And so this is where I have really promoted an alternative one where the water outcome is under the conservation easement, and then you have some flexibility under that. And again, the landowner may want to retain some of that water for some limited use and abandon it on other land. So it could be, there's just a myriad of ways of negotiating these deals with the landowners. Go ahead to the next slide, if you will. So the other reason why, when we looked at alternative 1 and 2 there, when you look at alternative 1, one of the huge advantages of alternative 1 is value. When appraiser, so one of the things Scott mentioned was the appraisal of this. It's such a key component. And also, you guys should all know that we use certified appraisers. They're certified to do conservation easement valuations. And so you cannot just get any appraiser out there and have that qualify for an NRCS funded easement or a DOD or necessarily or meet the state tax credit program. So these are certified appraisers. And so one of the first things we do is we bring in that appraiser and look at some different scenarios on valuation. And if you go with the alternative 1 where you put water under the umbrella of that conservation easement, you increase the value because of that opportunity loss that those landowners are now looking at by curtailing their production, their farm production by the that limiting of water. Now you have by foregoing that opportunity, you have increased the value of that conservation easement. So now you have some valuation in the water. You have the valuation of the subdivision and development. Those restrictions all start adding up. And when you go to fund a conservation easement versus funding just a water outcome, in other words, you now bring in all these other funding sources. You bring in DOD and their REFI program. You bring in NRCS and the RCPP program. You bring in the Playa Lakes Venture, and you bring in all these other potential funding mechanisms when you get a more holistic outcome with your conservation easement. And so it's something to really think about as you move forward here. And then, and really down here on the last thing is kind of the demonstrated trust we have with all these funders. Scott mentioned that we have a long history. But these funders, whether it's REPI, DOD, whether it's NRCS, we work with these guys day in and day out, and we have a demonstrated trust. We've brought a lot of good deals to the table, and they know that when they deal with us, we have demonstrated good projects, good holistic projects with all of the things they're looking for, conservation, etc. So go ahead, Scott, move to the next slide if you would. So again, funding sources that you guys, the main ones you guys will be looking at are NRCS, the Department of Defense, local government. Mitigation funding is a good opportunity for you guys potentially, and private foundations. We use them. We use all of those. I mean, those are kind of more specific to your situation here, these 5. But I'm gonna speak to a couple of those more specifically, and I think some of you are aware of them. But go ahead and move to the next slide. We'll talk about NRCS. So NRCS has 2 ways of funding easements. One is more of the state, the Department of Ag dedicates funding through NRCS to the various states for conservation easement work, and that's dedicated, just some funding is dedicated to each state. And these are more opportunistic in nature. Anybody across the state can apply for these ASAP easements, and this is what Scott and I typically work with. But under a second alternative here, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, RCPP, it allows kind of it goes right straight from the federal coffers to a dedicated region or a dedicated outcome, i.e. water outcome, watershed outcome, conservation outcome, fish, steelhead and salmon recovery, for instance. So they have kind of a dedicated funding where you're not competing statewide for that money like you are in alternative 1, where it's coming to the state and you're competing with projects all over the state. You guys have a great collaborative position here. A lot of partners, a lot of potential partners, and in my opinion, especially like a paleo channel group of landowners would bode well under an RCPP proposal. And I think New Mexico Association of Conservation Districts, as you guys mentioned, an RCPP is probably already underway, and this is something that Blake Prather and Mayor Ladner, or I'm sorry, sorry, David, Mayor Lansford. We've talked about this in the past, where I feel like this is just a great avenue for your collective partnership as this RCPP. And so go ahead to the next slide, Scott. And under the Department of Defense, they have kind of a similar situation where they have the REPI, which is more structured for buffer areas around Cannon Air Force Base, for instance. 70,000 acres around Cannon Air Force Base is kind of has been defined as kind of a buffer area to help basically it just helps make sure, ensures that they have their training and testing ability in the future, and we do that, as Scott said, with White Sands Missile Range. They have we work with them on a cooperative agreement. They have the same program where they're buffering White Sands, but theirs is more like 700,000 acres that we're working on over there. But basically, they're buffering these missile ranges and testing areas just to ensure that there's not a bunch of encroachment that's not compatible with their training and testing. So they can continue into the future with their program. But they also, similar to NRCS, they have a REPI challenge, and that is a federally competitive program under REPI that it's $15 million a year, and if you have a good project like yours where there's a large collaborative effort to accomplish something from a watershed perspective or something, you compete for this 15 million. You're competing with all the different armed forces. So in this case, we're Cannon Air Force. Now they're competing with the Navy, with the Army, etc. But if they get that money, it's dedicated specifically to those projects in that region. So similar to NRCS, this REPI has this REPI challenge. We've talked about utilizing this in that area as well, and feel like it's a good option. And again, Mike Ford, the Conservation Fund, has been working with the Department of Defense and Cannon Air Force Base out there, and how we would work. You know, we don't want to step on Mike Ford's toes, and then of course Debbie Hughes with the New Mexico Association of Conservation Districts. They have been the applicants for those projects, not us, and so that would have to, you know, be vetted out by you guys, how that would all work in the future. So just to give you an idea, I mean, you know, just another complexity that you have to think about here. But the REPI challenge, and I've talked to Mike Ford a couple of years back, that this would be a great REPI challenge program, and we work really well with these folks. We partnered with them in the past, and as Scott mentioned, we partnered with them on the Davis easement there. So, okay, go ahead and move forward, Scott. And actually, one more thing I would like to say about NRCS and DoD. It's not a lot. Oftentimes, you cannot match federal funding sources. In our business, we run into that all the time. Fortunately, because of situations like this, NRCS and DoD REPI programs, the ASAP program and the REPI programs are compatible, and you can match those federal funds, so you could potentially fund 100% of your conservation easement. So in other words, that conservation easement value that Scott was talking about, typically we can only fund 50% or 80%. We got to find the match. A real nice part about DoD REPI and NRCS ASAP is you can match those two funding sources and provide 100% of that financial benefit to a landowner. So a really unique situation there. Other funding sources coming down the pike, the 30/30 initiative. That's a initiative right now that's getting some traction globally and in the U.S. And that is an initiative to protect 30% of our lands by the year 2030, oceans and land. And so this one is something we're keeping an eye on, and it probably will bring a lot of funding, and a lot of funding through some of these mechanisms that are already established potentially, because again, why recreate the wheel? So they'll probably be coming down through NRCS, through DoD, and a lot of other mechanisms, Land and Water Conservation Fund, for instance, and just so a myriad of funding possibilities there. Pine Lakes joint venture we're working with on a number of projects, and they've been a great partner, and can provide some funding for this as well. The water, obviously, the municipalities, the private utility companies, mitigation for contamination, etc. Those are all potential sources for funding. Private foundations we use a lot, especially with respect to matching. And something to keep in mind too, NRCS and DoD are both federal funding sources, and a lot of times landowners are a little gun shy of that. So that's something to keep in mind. You know, you think you have this funding, and a landowner may not, because of the requirements, because of these third-party rights that these funding authorities have and provide. There are some strings attached to that money, and the landowner has to be okay with that. And we run into that a lot. And so now we've got to find these private funding sources to fund these conservation easements. So the other thing is carbon credits are coming down the pike here too. And the short grass prairie, I think the importance of grasslands is becoming so much more recognized as an important component to carbon sequestration. And so those carbon credits could be something coming online here as a potential funding source down the road as well, and have in certain areas already. So go ahead to the next slide, Scott. So this is just again to that point that right now, you know, NMLC is not the applicant and at DoD or with NRCS on this project with respect to the RCPP. So yeah, depending on how you guys go, that all has to be vetted out. So go ahead, Scott, to the next slide. And again, this is something I always say is a key to success is a graceful execution of Plan B, where you're focused maybe on a certain outcome right now, I have not been involved with conversations over there as of over the past year. So I'm not sure where you guys are at on this whole deal, but you know, I consider the holistic approach here, and the point here is think conservation, think of this recharge, think of this these farmlands over a long term. I mean, this is a long-term effort, in my opinion, and really the broader landscape is really important to look at here. As you start, Scott, we use the tax credit program. We use a lot of these tax benefits. These are landowners that love their land. They want to protect it in perpetuity, or they want to make sure it stays in the family, or they want to be able to pass it along at a lower cost to somebody in the family, and so the tax benefits, you know, are sufficient in that case. Where you guys are looking at a specific area or a real need to secure this water, and you're changing a landowner's way of life, you have to provide more incentives. But again, when you're dealing with these funding sources, whether it's NRCS, whether it's DOD, or whoever, they do have these strings attached to that. Their funding, and it is public money, and it has to be appraised. And as part of that, you want to provide as close to that 100. You want to incentivize it with as much funding as possible. And so it becomes it's always opportunistic. It's always volunteer. These conservation easements or any of these water outcomes that you are looking at are always opportunistic in nature. And I think it's really important that you think long term here. If you get started today, I think you're looking at 4 to 10 years with somebody just hitting the ground running right now, as far as to see the real impacts of this effort. We work with NRCS, we think on these easements 3 to 5 years, you know, just by the time we get going and do the outreach and structure the deals and take them, and you have, once you have that money in hand, it's typically 3 to 5, it's 5 year term on that DOD REPI money and that NRCS money. So you need to, you know, you have quite a bit of time, but you really need to think on RCPP, which is a 5-year deal, or the REPI challenge money. There's the clock starts ticking when you get that money, and it's 5 years, and I think it can be extended, but I just think you really want to get those deals negotiated, but be able to go with a plan B if you cannot negotiate these deals with these landowners, and look at it long term, look at it in perpetuity, in my opinion. So go ahead to the next slide, Don. Again, it's a tough project for a myriad of reasons. You've got, you know, you're dealing with public funding, you're dealing with that public benefit that comes with a lot of scrutiny, audits, it comes with third-party monitoring and enforcement rights. So you have multiple landowners in a strategic area versus that opportunistic landowner out, you know, around that entire state. You've got to have a lot of creative solutions and strategies to get that done. And just having done this a number of times, we you know, again, White Sands Missile Range is similar in that we're working with a group of landowners that we have to get conservation easements on that ground and do the outreach with that. And as Scott mentioned, I think we've done 40,000 acres in the last 3 years there. But it takes, up in Idaho with that salmon recovery where you're changing water rights, you really get creative with how you do things, and it's you got to think out of the box on these deals. But you also have to know the confinements of these public funding mechanisms. So they all have their minimum terms that you have to adhere to. So you get creative within those confines is what is the trick to this, in my opinion. And that's what makes this a tough project. And changing a way of life for these landowners is the biggest part of it. And you need time to do that. It's that they need the time, and you have to be patient. You do not force this one. And then again, and this just goes to our history over there. You know, we have been looking at your situation over the last 5 years. We have a lot to learn about that area, about the water rights, seniority, et cetera, and the hydraulic, all of that. There's a huge learning curve here to all of this, and it will continue to be a huge learning curve. Each one of your projects, each one of your landowners will be very unique, and how that ties into these funding sources will be a real, that'll be the road to navigate for sure. And Scott, and I won't go into, Scott went into a lot of what goes on with our organization and the audits. When you start getting over $1 million, the audits we have as an organization, that we're continually auditing ourselves and providing audits to a lot of these funding sources already, so it's whether DOD or we work with you guys all of the time. So I just wanted to again touch on that funding component of this, and then also Scott and I, we work with farmers and ranchers every day, and we learn about a different operation every day, and how they rotate their cattle, and how they irrigate, and what time of year they irrigate, and what it means to them, and where they can curtail things, where they can't, you know. And we are just used to dealing with these operations day in and day out, and how to work with these landowners. So just wanted to point that out as well. And then next slide, Scott. I think that with that, I'll conclude and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Ron, Troy, Wilbur. Great presentation. At this time, we'd like to open it up for questions, and we ask that you announce your name and ask your question.
Can you hear me? This is Jeff Davis.
Yes, Jeff, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, so first of all, to Mr. Wilbur and Mr. Troy, thank you very much. You know, I've been drinking from the fire hose since this whole thing started. The more I learn, the more I want to learn. And so I really appreciate the presentation. That was a great job, and it's a lot of good information. And we feel like we are well armed, and the more well versed we get, the better off it is. So not really a question, just to thank you that as we continue to push the door open and look for opportunities to secure water so that we can ensure the stability of surrounding communities.
Oh, thanks, Jeff. And yeah, we crammed a lot of information into that 60-minute presentation. It was the 101. I mean, there's a lot to it, and I commend all of you guys for you know, really doing your due diligence and trying to understand how all of this works better.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
This is Mike Morris. I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I too want to thank Mr. Wilbur and Mr. Troy. That's just a tremendous amount of excellent information. Very, very helpful today. So thank you for your time. As a question, I wondered if you could kind of go back, Mr. Wilbur. You talked about some of the New Mexico Land Conservancy projects, White Sands, and you mentioned a Cannon Air Force Base project. I was wondering on all of those, who holds the easements on those projects?
Yeah, so I'm sorry I didn't make that more clear before, but we hold those easements. Okay. So, you know, with easement donations, the easements are always coming to us. If there's public funding involved, it just depends on the program. But fortunately, both the DOD and the NRCS allow the land trust to hold those easements directly. So the money, comes to us, and then we provide the funding at closing to the title company, and we're holding the easements and monitoring them. And as Ron mentioned, that most of those federal programs do have some kind of a contingent rights clause in there, and usually that language has to do with, if we were to fail to perform, like if we weren't monitoring, or if we cease to exist for some reason, then the NRCS or DOD or the public agency could step in and assume responsibility for that easement. But most of these programs are designed to be public-private partnerships. The federal agencies don't want to hold these easements, don't want to get into everything that's involved with doing it. So they're creating an opportunity for us. And as Ron said, I mean, we have to meet all of those requirements. But yeah, only in the case of some state-funded projects, there's some specific limitations in the state of New Mexico, like with the anti-donation clause in the state constitution, that if state funds are provided for the acquisition of a real estate interest, we have to co-hold those easements with the state agency. So we can't just unilaterally hold them. We have to co-hold them. But we've done that with a number of state agencies. So that's one other consideration if we were to ever, pull state funding into the loop.
Great, thank you, Mr. Wilbur. Appreciate that clarification. And again, Mr. Wilbur, Mr. Troy, thank you so much. Great information today. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
You're sure welcome.
Go ahead, Chris. This is Chris Bryant. Again, great presentation. We appreciate you all coming and bringing all this information to us. But to create a new land trust, who administrates that?
Well, so as I mentioned, I mean, a land trust is a private, 501c3, which means tax exempt nonprofit organization, and there's a process with the IRS to set up a nonprofit organization. So, typical requirements are, you have to have your articles of incorporation, you have to have your bylaws, you have to form a board of directors. I think in New Mexico, the requirement is a minimum of 3 to start. And then you can grow the board from there. But you have a board that basically is overseeing the nonprofit organization, and the board consists of members from the community. In our case, we're a statewide organization, so our boards come from all around New Mexico, representing different geographic areas, representing different skill sets that we feel we need on a land trust board. And so, typically on a land trust board, got to have your requisite attorney or two, right? Because these are legal, real estate transactions. Oftentimes we'll have a real estate person. We might have a finance person. In our case, we do so much with the farm and ranch community that we have representatives from the agricultural community on our board. Sometimes from the academic community, but typically, yeah, if you're talking about a local land trust, they would be representatives from your community that have an interest in your mission and some skills that would contribute to the success of the organization.
Thank you. A lot of good information. Appreciate it.
Sure, you're welcome.
James Ridling. Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
I've got a question. Can these water easements through NRCS be used for municipal use on these grants through NRCS? Or are they just water easements?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, there's got to be a conservation value associated with those deals. So, if you have, I think really what you have to do is demonstrate those conservation values and those agricultural practices. will remain intact in some fashion. And so when you just take water off of that ground and go to municipal use, I would say no. I don't think NRCS, I don't think it would qualify under NRCS. I really don't. But if you are now conserving, let's say 80% of that water, and a portion of it may be going to a municipal use, then I think you could argue that there is a conservation value of public benefit. And this, you know, Peter Nichols and yeah, I think maybe Debbie Hughes could speak to that better. I mean, as far as that's a great question, and it is a tough one. And I think you have to look at the whole picture there. And again, this is where you could put, you know, the water trust under a conservation easement. Now you're talking about different funding sources too, where your private foundations, DOD, you could, under a DOD funded program, you could probably do that. It wouldn't be a problem. But NRCS, I think you are going to have a challenge there.
Thank you. Could I ask another question?
Yes, sir.
What about the administrative costs? Can they be taken out of these grants, or?
Well, you know, typically the federal funders are going to provide funding for the actual easement acquisition, right? So, and all the related transactional costs. So, you know, I mentioned all the due diligence steps, you know, that need to be accomplished to put the easement in place. That would typically be covered, you know, the payment for the easement. And in some cases, they'll even provide some funding for the long-term stewardship. So I mentioned that, you know, it's a standard practice now for all land trusts to set aside a certain amount of funding to ensure adequate resources to monitor and legally defend their easements over time. And there's no, you know, exact number that I can give you for what would be required for that. But, you know, in our case, we're typically setting aside, you know, a minimum of say $8,000 to $10,000 per easement and pooling those funds so that if there ever were you know, a serious violation of the easement that required us to go to court and legally defend that easement, we would have, you know, we have a pool of resources that we built up now over 16 years. We have that, plus I mentioned the insurance program. So our Land Trust Alliance, which is the umbrella kind of association for all the land trusts in the United States, one of the services they provided a few years ago was to create their own insurance program to provide kind of major coverage for land trusts in the event of a violation. So, you know, again, that's just something that takes time to build those resources. Now, the actual administrative costs of running the land trusts, I mean, you know, if you're lucky, you'll find a federal funder that will maybe contribute towards the time and effort as you're working on a project. But, you know, that's one of the things I said. If you form your own land trust, I mean, you've got to be prepared to search out other sources of funding to sustain your operations, your basic operations, and ensure your sustainability over the long term. So, and that could potentially, you know, take, I mean, if you're just initially hiring an executive director with no staff, I mean, you can imagine that that's going to take up a significant part of their time, just doing that and meeting all the, you know, administrative requirements of the land trust.
My next question is on the appraisals of these wells. Would there be any appraisals per se as far as metering the wells or finding out how many gallons per minute that these wells, the existing wells, produce, and the amount of saturated thickness of the aquifer, and possibly to the depth of the red bed on these and the pump depths in the appraisals? Would that be part of the appraisals, or just the aesthetic value of the property?
I would think that really it's about the opportunity loss. So as those farmers curtail their water usage, they are basically curtailing their future income, and that reliability, you know, of more cash crops are going to, when you go to that dry farming, as you guys all know better than I do, you know, just the the dollars per acre go down quite a bit when you curtail that water. And so that's really the opportunity loss is kind of what's getting incorporated into the appraisal with those development rights and subdivision rights and all the other restrictions that landowner would be willing to forego to, you know, conserve water, et cetera, and provide that water and recharge, et cetera, that, you know, that area they might eliminate to apply a lakes, for instance, that income off of that ground, you know, could, you know, that would increase that appraisal of that conservation easement value, et cetera. And so all of those things go into that appraisal, and it's complex. And then, as you can imagine, trying to find a comparable value of a property that has a conservation easement that's similar in size, structure, et cetera, and all of these complexities that we're talking about. That's why you have to have a certified conservation easement appraiser. And the appraisals are expensive, and they're really some, you know, those are the guys you bring in at first, in my opinion. Those are the guys you want up on the front lines telling you what you think you can give value-wise, because that's what you're negotiating with the landowner. And the worst thing I think you can do is have unrealistic expectations from the landowners as far as what you're going to be able to pay under these federal programs, because they are going to be based on appraisal. And so you don't, you know, our motto versus over-promising and under-delivering. You don't get too much traction that way.
Right. I just want to make sure that if we buy water, any of this water, we have water to be able to pump out of the ground. Because some of these
obvious, you know, the hydrology is gonna, I mean, if they have a lot of water under them and therefore going that water, it's gonna increase the value substantially.
Exactly.
So yeah. And again, this goes back to the junior and senior water rights. The more senior, too, the more value. Right. So you got to look at all of that, and it gets complex with the appraisal.
Thank you.
Yep.
This is David Lansford. I have a question.
Yes, sir.
First of all, gentlemen, thank you for the presentation. Really felt like it was very comprehensive. My first exposure to conservation easements involved the phrase inclusive model. And one of the things that really made me an advocate for conservation easements, and what we are trying to do here, is that inclusive model, allowing everybody that's a stakeholder to participate in the process. And you bring up, Ron Troy brings up the advantages of using, you know, an existing land trust versus starting one from scratch. I understood that there was an incubation opportunity where a startup land trust could actually be incubated by an existing land trust. Is that something that you guys are familiar with in New Mexico? Is that something that is actually a potential reality, to where, you know, we could have that inclusive model here where the stakeholders here are involved on the board and driving the administration to succeed, as opposed to, you know, hiring a land trust that's based out of New Mexico with board members all over the state? You know, that to me is the difference. And the administrative expense associated with that, you know, is going to be pretty much the same, whether we're, you know, paying the New Mexico Land Conservancy the administrative fees or we're paying them here locally. Your thoughts on that?
Well, David, maybe I'll start and then Ron chime in if you've got anything to add. I mean, certainly there's different models that we could imagine working in your situation. I've been here, almost 17 years with New Mexico Land Conservancy. I will say, you know, when I first came down to New Mexico, there were, I think, 8 land trusts operating in the state. We're actually now down to 4. So rather than increasing, the number of land trusts has been decreasing over the last 15 years for a variety of factors. I mean, obviously New Mexico is a fairly poor state. I mean, in terms of resource availability. And so that's always a challenge, where are you going to get the funds to sustain an organization over time? But I mentioned the accreditation and, just all the changes that have occurred in the last 10 to 15 years with kind of the professionalization of the industry, if you will, setting the standards and practices. And we've actually transferred easements now from those 4 organizations because they have not been able to sustain their operations over time. Having said that, sure, if you look around, the region in the country, yes, in a situation like yours, you guys could potentially have a land trust, and perhaps you have the wherewithal to raise the funds locally and sustain that. And I can certainly see the appeal of having more local control and local representation. And yes, I think, I could say we'd be willing to, partner up and sort of mentor a startup organization. It could be, a contractual kind of thing for a period of time where we provide that kind of just technical expertise, or maybe even co-holding the easements, or just being a designated backup holder. But another, consideration, a big consideration is, sustaining that local trust and just having to set everything up from scratch. And I guess we're just trying to give you a little bit of a dose of reality that there's a lot to it, and it's gotten more complex. Another model that could potentially work is you guys just have some kind of a steering committee, a committee that would coordinate with us, and you guys would be kind of the eyes and ears on the ground. And obviously you'd have the relationships and be able to identify opportunities. But when an opportunity came up to actually work on an easement, then we would step in and actually complete the transaction and maybe hold it. And then you guys wouldn't be burdened with that, either having to figure out how to do the deal, but also just, the long-term stewardship of those easements. So different models.
But you did say that you would be willing to contractually work with the local community if we established our own land trust and, assist us in that process and be paid and compensated appropriately for it.
Yeah, I think it's something we would consider.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah.
One of the things too, to add to that, I think negotiating with these landowners and knowing where you can go with the different funding sources I really believe that is the biggest key to your success down the road, is having the ability to really hear what the landowner needs are relative to the various funding sources that you think might be available to that area. And that's really, that's the key to your success, is getting that landowner on board with a project that meets the funding criteria. And that's, I think, the biggest challenge here, personally.
Mr. Nichols has his hand raised. I think he's got a question.
I was just going to comment on a couple of things that Mr. Riddling brought up. But first of all, I just wanted to say, Scott and Ron, you've done a great job of really sort of laying out Land Trust 101 and also sort of setting forth the issues that the community really needs to face and deal with as they move forward with this. I think Ron's generally correct that the water that would be encumbered in a conservation easement would not be available for municipal use, but you could split up a specific water right or well permit, make part of it available for municipal use, and you could restrict the use of another part of it to stay in the aquifer and reduce the amount of depletion in the future. And with regard to appraisals, I think an appraiser would look at both what the permitted amount could be taken out of the well, as well as information available in terms of saturated thickness of the aquifer and sort of the specific conductivity and yield of an individual well in terms of coming up with an appraisal. If they were doing it on a parcel by parcel kind of basis, I think there's a possibility of having a broader appraisal that would be done on sort of a regional kind of basis, say for the Paleo Channel, and come up with some sort of default numbers that could be used across the Paleo Channel. So I just wanted to sort of chime in and add that information into the discussion. Again, Scott and Ron, great job.
Yeah, and thank you, Peter, and thanks for clarifying that too. Appreciate it.
Chet Spear here. From the county, we want to thank you folks for a great presentation. I learned a lot. A couple of questions I have is Mr. Wilbur, how are you guys funded?
So, I mean, our funding comes in through a variety of sources. I mean, you know, with any nonprofit, you know, a lot of our support just comes in from individual donors, you know, who support our mission, foundation grants. You know, we have been fairly successful in securing a number of private foundation grants over the years, both for our general operations as well as for projects like matching contributions for some of these federal programs that require a non-federal cash match. And then frankly, I mean, a lot of our money actually comes in through the projects in the form of landowner contributions. So, I mean, these are, again, real estate transactions, and we have kind of a quasi, you know, business / nonprofit, you know, hybrid model. And, you know, we're able, especially when we bring funding to the table, to sometimes secure larger contributions directly from the landowners. You know, we don't use the term like commission, but you know, contributions to cover transactional costs as well as stewardship costs, and sometimes our operating as well.
Is there a set fee that you collect, or is there a percentage of the sale that you?
We've worked on a percentage fee on a percentage basis, and we've also, you know, a lot of it is just tailored on a case by case basis. But I will say any of those landowner contributions, those cash contributions that they make are also potentially eligible, you know, as a charitable contribution. So both the, you know, donation of easement value as well as any contributions they make towards the transactional costs, with the exception of the appraisal, can potentially make them eligible for federal tax deductions.
And I would just add to that, when you're looking at your situation in that area, this is similar to the Lemhi Valley, where we targeted a group of landowners or Corrales or something, where I think in these instances you have to provide more incentive to get. I just see you're going to have some tough clients out there from a landowner perspective, and so the benefit you're going to have to provide, I think, is higher in that area. Especially when you're talking about changing their way of life. You know, we don't typically do that where we're pulling water and changing their future income. So you're dealing with a different situation. So you've got to think about maximizing your financial benefits to that landowner. Whereas these landowners, a lot of times we work with, they want us to protect their land, and they're willing to pay a fee, you know, or a percent or something along those lines. It's a little different situation you guys are dealing with, in my opinion.
Well, this is Debbie Hughes. I was going to provide some information, but I see that Justin with the city has his hand up. So I wanted to let him go first.
Well, thank you, Debbie. I noticed your hand had been up for a while, so I was going to defer and allow you to speak first.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you. And so, Ron and Scott, once again, thank you guys for the information. A couple of quick questions, and one of them may be duplicative. When it comes to actually negotiating the easement terms with the landowners, is there a way to put language within those terms that we're all talking about water, we're all talking about water rights, to where that water is, with the part that's not put in conservation, that's potentially left over for municipal use, to be dedicated to a certain municipality or dedicated to a certain governmental agency for that use? And then from a management standpoint, if it's within the conservation easement, does it matter who holds that conservation easement, because they have to honor what's within that easement itself? And then my second question is, we've talked about where your revenues potentially come from, and we talked about operational expenses. But as we look to try and potentially create a land trust, what are your operational costs? I mean, is it $500,000 a year that it's costing you guys to operate the New Mexico Land Conservancy and monitor these conservation easements? Just so this group has an understanding of what is potentially in front of them.
I'm going to take a shot at your first question, the water, and then and Peter, please correct me or add to this. But in my opinion, you guys, where you're talking about transferring water from that paleo channel through a pipe into the community water system or whatever, I guess my suggestion or something to look at, I think we all need to understand, or I definitely need to understand it better. But when you look at the true conservation, like RC, the NRCS, it was established to protect those agricultural practices and that future food production for Americans, right? It's a public money for that purpose. So if you're going to conserve that water, you leave it in the Ogallala. Obviously, it's really important to keep that static, and hopefully recharging versus, keeping it on the trajectory it is as far as the reduction in the levels. So I guess when the point I was trying to make early is you've got to look at this long term from a conservation standpoint. Just restrict that or try to curtail the water usage on these farms. Let them have enough to keep those farms sustained, to some certain degree. Let them have some water. Let the Playa Lakes Venture Group have some water to restore those wetlands as they reseed native plants and whatnot. Leave that water in the Ogallala. And you guys, even from a municipal standpoint, I think have to think about long-term sustainability. Sustainability is your whole key to success, and how you guys do that from a municipal and commercial perspective, as well as out on those farms and future food production. That's what you need to think about, not how you buy water over here and pipe it over to there just to reuse it again. And I think you'll find that the funding sources will be a lot more amenable to funding those types of ideas in that long-term sustainability. That's your bottom line, and every one of these is going to be unique. But if you can keep it within those confines, and you can demonstrate that that is the objective, and not just buying it from A to get it to point B to reuse the same water and not think about that Ogallala long-term, I think you'll find that the funding will come. But I think I guess that's, in my opinion, how I could best answer your question with what little I know.
And next we've got Debbie Hughes, and then we'll have Commissioner Martin.
Thank
Hi,
you.
Debbie.
Hi. Yeah, Scott and Ron, you did do a great job with talking about very complicated issues. Ron, from my understanding with the Farm Bill programs, there is groundwater depletion is one of the things they look at. And so when some of their programs, like they've even got an Equip Now, where they want to be able to keep landowners out there and keep them producing, but they realize there's groundwater depletion. And so they actually have programs where they'll pay for grass seeding, they'll pay for fencing, this kind of thing. So my understanding is the water rights are a different issue, because those are a private property right. Those are controlled by the state. So when you said in part of your presentation how important it is to get the state engineer involved, you're right on. So there is a couple different things that can happen. They can leave it in the aquifer, like you said, for just groundwater recharge, or I would consider probably a lot of this water in the future they're going to need to use for the cities. So that's when, because you're going to have to change the water right from ag water to commercial water rights. So, but that should not limit them being able to participate in conservation easement programs through NRCS or RCPP. And I want to let you know too, for your information, that we have already applied for a RCPP for that area that would be for the Paleo Channel. We won't know, for several more months if we're gonna even be awarded, and then it'd be, like a year. But we definitely did this to try to already help leverage the REPI funding. But my understanding, the water rights issue is it can be part of the easement, but it will still have to be handled separately with the state engineer's office.
And yeah, to that point, Debbie, I think, that's my understanding is if you can leave it in the ground and recharge that Ogallala, you're in great shape. But if you're converting agricultural water to municipal water, that's where we have had challenges before with NRCS funding. And I think that's what I was trying to demonstrate there. And now the question is, if you take 100% of that water and you leave 80% in, and 10% or 20% goes to municipality use or commercial use, and the rest goes into the Ogallala, if you could sell that under NRCS funding, and that's still a question I don't know. But once you start converting,
I believe you can, as long as you're still in ag production on that land.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I guess I would just add to that, when I look at easements in general, I mean, you think of private property rights. I mean, there's a variety of rights that come with private property ownership. You've got, development rights, you've got resources that you can use, you've got water rights. What the easement is doing is it's not necessarily completely restricting 100% of those rights. I mean, it seems to me like there's some room for negotiation. But I would agree with Ron. I mean, got to find out what that threshold is to still be able to secure the federal funding. But like with development rights, I mean, it's not an all or nothing thing. And I would think with water too, as long as 80% or whatever it is, you're able to demonstrate that you've still got enough water that can sustain the agricultural operation, that they wouldn't necessarily have to give up 100% of their water rights through the easement. But I mean, that's the question that we need to get answered, because I think it's going to vary from funder to funder. And I think DOD, like Ron said, probably is a lot more flexible on that than say NRCS. But
Okay, next up we've got Commissioner Martin, followed by Mr. Nichols.
Well, I don't know if I'm just confused or misinformed, but the REPI that I was explained to by Rick Masters was the DOD's not buying water rights. So as far as piping water and all the concerns about who's going to get the water, that doesn't even come into play. I believe the REPI, as it sits right now, is just to pay a landowner to reduce his 3 acre-feet to 1.3 acre-feet. And that's what the easement will be. And like y'all are also concerned with on that RCCCP is whether or not that landowner will also be able to sell that. Basically, he's been reduced to a municipal rate. I think that's going to be one of the big concerns for the landowners if they want to enter into this REPI, is determining whether that's going to be a revenue source in the future for him. But as far as the infrastructure, pipeline, all this other, my understanding is that the farmer won't change the thing that he's doing. All he's doing is reducing his usage from that 3 acre-feet to the 1.3. Am I misunderstanding that from the DOD, or is missing another part of what's going on here?
Well, some of you can maybe speak to this a lot better, but I think when you're looking at the 3.2 acre-feet allotted for irrigation practices, you're looking at a consumptive use when which is more in that 1 acre line. So when you basically curtail that water right off of that land, you're drying up land. I mean, if you're going to sell those water rights, and this is again, state engineer has to get involved in this, but and look at the acres and the actual irrigation usage versus consumptive usage and what that conversion is. And I think that's the conversion you're talking about, but I'm not sure. But you're so right on REPI. I mean, REPI is not as concerned with water. I mean, that's their funding is pretty flexible. I mean, they're looking at basically their testing and training operations in the future, and they're providing easements basically to make sure, just ensure again, their training and testing can occur into the future. So they don't have these limitations. Like NRCS is a really experienced long-term conservation easement program. You know, they've administered it for a long time, and they know all of the ins and outs. They've been through this so many times. So now you are really looking at some real guidelines to ensure that those agricultural practices are protected if they're going to fund this project. And REPI only funds 50% with the Air Force REPI project. So if you're looking at 50% of, you know, a couple $1 million deal, you're still got to come up with that other $1 million. And so how are you going to do that if it doesn't qualify for NRCS? And so that's what you got to be thinking about as well. I mean, all these programs, you know, how are they conducive to all these programs and other funding sources potentially? So,
Commissioner Martin, are you good?
That's good enough. Thanks.
Okay. I know I said Mr. Nichols was next, but I need to back up a little bit here and see if Manager Holwalk got his second question answered earlier.
Oh, yes. Thanks for reminding. Yeah, you were asking about what does it actually cost to run a land trust? And I mean, I can't give you an exact answer. I can tell you that, you know, I mean, if you look at our operation, we have 6 staff members, pretty lean and mean operation for a statewide. You know, our basic operations are, you know, kind of fluctuate between anywhere from $750,000 to $1 million a year. That's not counting all of the, you know, project related costs, just kind of the basic operating costs. I would think for a local land trust, you know, at a minimum, you're probably looking at a, you know, at least a 2, maybe 3 person operation, a director, and, you know, an administrator, and some kind of a project person. So, you know, somewhere probably between a, you know, $250,000 to $500,000 max. And then you'd have to think about the stewardship as well, you know, setting aside resources for your easement portfolio as it grows and everything that comes with that. But
thank you. That gives us a good ballpark figure. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, this is Jeff Davis. I'd like to clarify about REPI. So the reason we entered into the readiness and environmental protection integration in this endeavor was, no kidding, to secure water rights. And REPI does give us the absolute opportunity to purchase water. And if purchasing water rights isn't the method that the farmers want us to utilize, and we enter into a diminished capacity, such as the city did with the Snell and Wall properties, where they took the acre feet and took the 80% and allowed the 20% to remain on the farm for the farmers to continue to use what might be 6 or 8 wells, even with the writing into the legal paperwork that said they could drill additional wells. And so there's a couple things happening here. Absolutely, number one, we need to secure water rights in the Paleo Channel, and that groundwater has an absolute secondary effect to the Ute water pipeline. Is it our intention to pipe it out immediately and try to make it a municipal cost? No. First and foremost, we're looking to secure the groundwater that right now for all of our and we have generational farmers, and we are definitely in tune with that. So we're not asking them to stop farming altogether. We have large landowners, Danny Fish and Vince DeMaio, on both ends of the Paleo Channel, and lots of players in between. So first and foremost, bring a hydrologist in and, no kidding, identify where all the largest producing wells are, because we need to know that we're targeting the right landowners in the right sessions, and so that we apply the money for REPI directly proportionately to what we hope to accomplish. Yeah, so we entered in with REPI because it gave us the opportunity to purchase water rights. And again, we're going to talk to each one of the farmers as they go. This is the absolute value of the Soil and Water Conservation District too, because you know, I could walk out there and talk to these guys and get the door shut in my face, and I'm not the person to talk to them anyway. But there are smart people that some of these are affected by our decisions and how we move forward. But we have several things at play too, not just the ability to move into or maintain ranging, grazing and range cattle and grassland farming or dryland farming, but the joint playa water venture that runs the same paleo channel that we're interested in, along with landowners now. And as everybody knows, that's a primary recharge back to the Ogallala Aquifer. And the Air Force's only request in any of this is that we have water when we say we need water. But our secondary and probably just equally as important is this is a personal endeavor. I mean, I entered into this with the knowledge that yes, it's resiliency for the base, and we want to ensure that the base isn't affected. But well, I'll just say it's more important. I live in the surrounding community. If the surrounding communities begin to diminish because the water continues to diminish, then we collapse on ourselves, and pretty soon we don't have a capability even within the Clovis domain. We have to be aware of that, and we already know we're behind the gun. And so we're making money by having opened up the door. We've already broached the proposal to the RCPP, and I've already told the Air Force, you know, I could spend $15 million quickly along that paleo channel. I felt like that was our goal. That's what we were going to look at for matching dollars. And ultimately, however we get there, if it's diminished water rights and we say, hey, we want to take you from 3 acre feet down to 1.2, then that's what we'll do. If we can get dryland farmers who aren't using their wells and still have productive wells to sell, then that's what we'll do. And if we can encourage farmers to go to dryland farming and incentivize them through tax incentives and conservation easements, then that might eventually lead us to water purchases also. Ultimately, we're trying to protect the farmer. We're not asking our generational farmers to give up what they've done, their lives, and so not be able to continue that same livelihood with their next generation. But we have to secure the surrounding areas, and the primary focus is water.
Mr. Nichols?
I just wanted to follow up on the question that Justin asked earlier. I think it's quite possible to draft a conservation easement so that certain of the water rights would be encumbered for either non-use or for ag use, and certain portions of the water rights, say 1.2 acre feet, would be available for municipal use. And you could even specify, you know, exactly which municipality it would be, say the city of Clovis or Eastern New Mexico Water Authority or whatever. You could do that, and I've seen it done. In fact, I've done it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Any other comments? I don't see any hands actively raised. I'm sorry.
Peter, back to that point, was that NRCS funded where you have done that before?
I don't remember, Ron. I think some of the financing stuff can affect how you do things.
Yeah.
As you rightly pointed out, it gets complicated when you figure out what the funding pie is going to look like and all the different pieces of it, and what they all require or don't require or do allow. You know,
yeah, no, I have broached that ag use to commercial use before with NRCS, and it's a huge red flag in that arena. And I just was curious, but as things get more desperate, as to Debbie's point too, you know, the Ogallala, if it's recharging the Ogallala to some fashion, I think that's going to be the litmus test, I think. So.
And the NRCS is funding a bunch of projects in Colorado that are basically recharging an aquifer, and by recharging the aquifer, they're extending its length and they're making it water available not only to the farmers that stay in business growing potatoes or whatever, but also the many municipalities in San Luis Valley.
And I think that's something you guys all have to think about. It's a great point. The Ogallala versus a pipe, where you have a physical pipe taking that water from that farm to a municipal use versus allowing it to actually infiltrate into the Ogallala and pulling it up, even if it's out of another well. But it's just different, you know, when you are doing that and looking at the funding mechanisms. So something to consider.
I think Doyle, you had your hand raised.
Yes, I have one question. Who bears the cost of the due diligence, like the appraisal, the title search and things of this, the landowner or the land trust, or is it shared?
So it varies depending on the funders. You know, DoD, for example, is probably one of the best all-around programs because, I mean, they pay for everything: due diligence, pay for the acquisition, provide some stewardship funding, and even, you know, like over White Sands, they're covering some of our time and effort on that project. NRCS typically will just pay for the easement itself, and then the land trust has to figure out, you know, how it's going to pay for the due diligence and the stewardship. And that's why, you know, oftentimes we have to go back to the landowner and negotiate a landowner contribution. And I mean, you know, Ron made the point that he thinks it's, you know, it's going to be more challenging over here, and I agree. You know, we're going to have to maximize, you know, the resources we can bring to bear probably to get landowners to participate. But I also do think that, you know, there's always an opportunity when you're actually bringing some money to the table to, you know, where they can share the wealth a little bit and have some skin in the game. But otherwise, you know, you'd have to look to other outside sources. You know, your land trust, if that's the route you go, would have to turn to, you know, foundations or corporate donors or, you know, other people that would support the overall effort in the region.
Okay.
And as a follow-up to that too, I would say that when you're talking about starting a land, the municipalities might be a good source of funding for some of those administration and other costs, the due diligence. So you have restricted funds and unrestricted funds. And as those come to the table, think about the best use of those, quote, unrestricted funds, whereas NRCS and DoD funds are restricted. But as Scott said, DoD is they cover a lot more ground as far as some of those things. But those unrestricted funds are extremely valuable when you start these negotiations with all of these landowners and how you get from point A to Z. So unrestricted funds, how you utilize those, whether it's on the ground on those projects or whether it's setting up a land trust and doing the administrative part of that, think, you know, weigh that decision, because that's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Hughes?
Yeah, I just want to add to what Ron was just saying is I hope that all of you over that part of the state and the landowners realize that there's NRCS available money now through a couple of different easement programs. You don't have to wait for this RCPP. And we need to be accessing these NRCS easement programs because that's the only way we're going to be able to access the REPI money, because it's a 50% match. So we need one to get the other. And I think what you're saying about some of the entities stepping up and helping pay for some of these upfront costs, it's going to take some carrots like that to help get the landowners off their, you know, the first step, because they don't want to go out and pay these huge upfront costs when they're unsure about the easement programs and the land trust and all this kind of stuff. And so if the city and the county and all the players can help with some of these things to get things going, then, we've applied for the RCPP, but that's not money coming quickly. And the quicker that you start using some of these other easement programs and other things, the faster that Jeff and those folks at Canon are going to be able to get more of the REPI money. It's not going to come otherwise, though. They've already put the 1.36 million or whatever out there, and they need to see that that's going to be spent before they start giving more of the 15 million. Plus, we're going to have to show that we've got the matching. So think about those things too, because to ever get this thing started, it's gonna take everybody working together. So.
Yeah, and I would just add, I wouldn't rule out the possibility of some landowners, donating a portion of the easement value. I mean, every landowner's different, their financial situations are different. And, I mentioned the federal deduction and the state tax credit. I mean, those are fairly significant benefits that, can also help offset the capital gain from the payment on the easement. So, you just have to run the numbers on every project. And, it really also depends on the landowner's financial situation. In that moment in time, that year, they may have some big, beyond their personal income, some big capital gain that needs to be offset. You don't know. So I wouldn't rule that out. And those are just the, kind of creative ways that, we'd have to approach this and look at every single project, because, yeah, I mean, it'd be great if everyone could be paid 100%, but that's going to be challenging. I mean, we're lucky that the NRCS matches DOD and the other way around, like Ron said and Debbie said. I mean, that doesn't happen every day where you can do that, but yeah, the timing of the programs is different, and yeah.
And I'm going to mention another real challenge to this project, and that is with respect to the ownership interest. And the first thing we do is a title search when we look at these parcels. And if these landowners have entered into lease agreements with wind turbine companies or providing sand to fracking companies, water, etc., every one of these landowners is going to be really unique as far as what deals have negotiated. And if they have negotiated those deals, and there are some encumbrances already on their land that offer up a lot of, kind of compromise the conservation values that NRCS funds, there's a lot of challenges with respect to that when you try to get NRCS funding, and they already have exploited through commercial uses their land with leases they've already entered into and stuff. So we don't take it for granted that we can use this funding on every parcel. That's one of the first things we do, is get out there and look at what they've already have agreed to with other interests out there. So think about that. I mean, another potential challenge in that area right now, especially with fracking, the need for sand and water, et cetera, and the wind turbines. They've been hitting these landowners around the state pretty hard in some of these areas. So you got to see what's already been negotiated out there.
The other big elephant in the room is if you're trying to leave water in the Ogallala Aquifer and you've got all the farmers right on the Texas line continuing to pump it out as fast as you're putting it in there or leaving it in there, I'm sure all that's got to be looked at too, or hydrologically, before all these investments are made. But anyways, just another thing to be thinking about for long-term water sustainability.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other raised hands at this time. Any other comments from anybody? Orlando, I don't know if you wanted to take things over from here.
Thank you, appreciate that. And what I'd like to do is pass it over to Justin and let him close the program today.
Thank you, Orlando, and thank you, Ron, Scott, for the information. I think that it's been very helpful. It's a lot of information coming fast, and if the other individuals like me, the more I learn, the more questions I have, and so I think that we could potentially be reaching back out to you in the future to try and maybe assist and answer any questions that not necessarily have come to us yet, but I'm sure that there may be some in the future. Also want to thank our audience. It's going on close to 2 hours now. And so it's your patience and your willingness to stick with us and listen and learn is greatly appreciated. And just carving out this time during your busy schedules is greatly appreciated. And so with that, thank you everybody for attending. If you have any questions that you haven't answered or think of in the future, please feel free to get with Orlando or Lance and myself, and we will certainly reach out to Ron and Scott and see if we can't get those answered. So thank you everyone for attending, and for the other individuals like me, the more I learn, the more questions I have.
Thank you guys for your time.
So
Really
I think
appreciate it.
that we could potentially be reaching back out to you in the future to try and maybe assist and answer any questions that not necessarily have come to us yet, but I'm sure that there may be some in the